think more in terms of practice and thinking about these ideas of shapes, values, and colors. And I'm going to start with a bigger brush and just tone the canvas. Now my colors here, I'm going to use just burnt sienna to draw with and a lot of paint thinner. So if you were doing watercolor, you don't need to tone the paper, but maybe you would draw those big shapes with burnt sienna or raw lumber or some kind of earth color, just to establish the big shapes and the big values. Again, oil is opaque, so I can put down a middle value and then put the darks and lights on top. Whereas in watercolor, you kind of have to go from the lights to the darks. I mean, I really admire watercolor because you have to really know what you're doing. With oil, I can mess up and scrape off. But with watercolor, I think it's almost more of a master's medium than it is a beginner's medium. But a lot of people start with watercolor because it's easier to work with, you know, as far as just using water and maybe a little bit cheaper than oils. But I find oil a little bit easier to learn from, again, because it's kind of forgiving. You can scrape it off or paint over it. So this gives me a middle value. It's not a dark or it's not a light, it's in the middle. Then as I add value on top of here, I can judge it better. And that's kind of the key. So I'm going to use, again, burnt sienna. If I have to get a little bit darker than this, I'll add a little ultramarine blue. But pretty much just burnt sienna. And I want to establish those big shapes. I'm going to start with a line that kind of separates the sky from the ground. And I try to put the brush down and not pick it up a lot, just kind of leave it on the canvas or the board and just start scribbling in shapes. I don't want to outline anything, but I don't want to get a lot of paint thinner on here and just start with a single outline. It's just too hard to get the proportions right, but I can see the volume or the big shape of something and just putting the brush down and just lightly filling in the shapes. Even though I'm going over some of the light areas, I can wipe those out later.
We have a couple of questions that I think can be helpful for everyone who is a bit new to oils. And the first one is when we're used to watercolor, we're used to diluting the paints with water, but with oil that isn't possible. So do you dilute the paint often, frequently, and how do you do that? Is it a special medium?
Yeah, no, this is just paint thinner. I use Gamsol, which is from Gamblin Paints. And it's a paint thinner, but it's also supposedly non-toxic. So you don't have to worry about breathing in fumes. But at this stage, this is the drawing stage on my canvas board. I'm not thinking color, I'm just thinking drawing. So I want to use mostly the paint thinner with a little bit of paint there. And this is my can of paint thinner. This is also where I clean my brushes, but I got a lot of paint thinner in there.
Thank you. And then the second question was, is there a specific reason why you chose this earthy orangey tone for this sketching part of the painting process?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can use a lot of different things. I use burnt sienna because it's an earth color and also because it's warm. I like the warmth of it. It'll, wherever it comes through the color, it'll kind of warm things up. And I think a warm landscape has a better feel to it than a cool landscape. Although I do tone it with a cool color sometimes. One of the demos, full demos I do in the lesson is with a violet. I tone it and draw with a violet instead of burnt sienna. But I prefer the warmth. But it's good to try different. You just don't want a real bright like a cad yellow or a cad red. Um, Sometimes I will draw with a raw umber, which is also an earth color, and it's also warm. It's just not quite as a reddish orange as this. Okay, now I can refine these shapes, kind of come back over them and be a little more careful. Got the trees in the background here. And I haven't blocked in any lights yet, which I'll do with by just wiping out. And I got this shape down here. Everything is just kind of a shape right now. I want to be accurate as far as the proportions, but I don't want to be accurate as far as detail. Detail will really kill a painting at this stage. Detail is for the very end. And even then, I want to be very careful where and how much detail, because detail can really kill a painting. A painting works because of the bigger, more simple shapes, dark and light shapes, and detail really destroys those shapes. So the simpler I can keep it, the better. Now I've got a paint brush that I have some paint thinner on here, and I kind of wipe off the excess paint thinner. And now I'm wiping out to establish the lights. And right now I just want two values. I want the light and I want the dark shadow. So there's the roof. That's kind of one of the main big shapes. And right now I got one shape for the dark of the clouds, one shape for the light of the clouds, one big shape for the darks in here, and I got a shape for the light, and I'll have a shape for the light here, and another shape of dark here. So I'll have about, I didn't count them, but 6, 7 big shapes. And when you can reduce your subject to that, it becomes a lot easier to figure out color. But if I got 30 or 40 little shapes in here that I'm drawing, then color becomes really difficult. And when I start the color, you'll see that because I'll only have, again, 6 or 7, 8 big shapes I have to worry about mixing color for. But also, besides color, is the value, how dark or light the color is going to be. And I'll work some of that out here in the drawing. So I'm going to get the... Set aside 2 schedules. One schedule is for finished paintings, whether they're for shows or galleries. But then your other schedule is strictly for practice, where the end result is not a finished painting. The end result is just trying to learn, trying to stretch yourself to maybe think a little bit differently about color or composition. Paint thinner on the brush. Again, I've wiped off the burnt sienna and just a little bit of paint thinner in there. Now, if I have this loaded with a bunch of paint thinner, it'll all start running down. So you have to have just the right amount. And the more you do it, the more you get the feel for how much paint thinner to have. Make this roof a little bigger. But this is a great way to draw, to see shape instead of outline. Now, I know in watercolor, you have to do a little bit of outline first. But even in watercolor, you go to big shapes of value right away, value and color. Same thing here. I like to use some outline to kind of refine the drawing. But I want to keep it very limited, very simple. Shape is better than outline because there's not a lot of outline in nature. Nature is one shape against another shape, this light shape against this dark shape. And the more you can see things that way, the better. Oops. Now I'll block in some of these. And compositionally, I want a good artistic balance here. That doesn't mean equal weight on both sides or top and bottom. I'm going to have most of the weight on this side, and it's going to be balanced by a smaller shape, the barn on this side. And that's usually how a good composition is. Most of the weight on one side or the other, with something smaller that kind of gives some artistic balance to the whole composition. What I don't want is equal weight on both sides. That looks kind of static, too symmetrical. Symmetrical composition is good for like posters and all kind of announcements, commercial work. But when in fine art or painting, you don't want symmetry. You want a artistic balance that gives a little more weight on one side than the other. So I've got a light tree there. You can see I'm just wiping out for the lights. And if I can simplify my subject, then the drawing and the value and the color becomes a lot easier. Now I'm wiping my brush off each time so I can get it clean again. And I'm getting the fence that's in front of the barn. I see the fence as a positive shape and the darks are a negative shape. So I'm just looking for positive or negative shape or dark and light shape. It's probably a better term to use than positive and negative. But then I have another little rooftop way in the background right here. I'm going to go back to the shadow. Again, I have just two values right now, the light and the dark. And this is a sunny day, a little bit kind of hazy. There are clouds, but the sun is coming through. Now, my thumbnail drawing was three values, the light, the overall dark, and then a real dark. And I'll add that in a minute as well. I apologize if you can hear the rooster in the background. We have chickens just beside the studio, and hopefully you can't hear those. Now I'm going to use some outline. Don't need it to be that dark. And I'm going to outline some things just to refine them, maybe make the shape a bit better. And this is my third value. It's a little bit dark. So I have I have two darks. The overall dark and the real dark, which I'm kind of adding right now. And if I can keep my values to just those three for a long time, and then at the very end of the painting, start adding a few more other values, which will be detail. That's what detail is, more value changes. Then it works a lot better. Now I've got a little bit of a drawing problem compared to the barn in the photograph. The barn in the photograph comes down here and it comes out a little bit further. So I can make that change now, or I could leave this because this still works. It still looks like a barn. But if I prefer that other shape, it's just a matter of wiping out and making that a bit longer. Still a little bit off compared to the barn in the photo. But I'm usually not that worried about that as long as it works. And it still gives the impression of what I'm after. If the original shape in the photograph of this barn is more important to me, then I will change it. But if it's not, I won't. So I'm changing it a little bit, but then I'm going to leave it. But it's a lot easier to make changes. So since everything is just a light and a dark, I'm seeing shape instead of outline. And again, just using outline to refine things, make them maybe a bit more accurate. Then I've simplified the trees in my photograph. I have a light shape for the trees and a dark shape. And I have the dark shape down there already, so I'm going to establish where the lights are. Come back. And again, this is mostly paint thinner. It's not, the color is not thick at all. So if you're used to watercolor, this is like a real light wash of burnt sienna. So there's my light and dark shapes on the trees there. And I'll wipe out for the lights here. And I've eliminated some things. There's a barn back in there. I've eliminated a lot of the detail in front. Simplified the fence quite a bit and eliminated a lot of the fencing in front. And I'm about done with this, so we can start color. Okay. I don't know. So I'm going to try and stick for a little bit, just the burnt sienna, cad yellow, and the ultramarine blue. That's a limited palette. I generally do a limited palette first when I block things in. Then I add the other colors to kind of use them more as accent colors or to kind of modify the color a little bit. So I'm going to see this as a red-orange. It's a definite color from the color wheel. The opposite of doing that is just trying to mix and mix until you match the photograph. And that never works real well. It ends up looking like a poor copy of the photograph. But if I can think in terms of mixing a definite color from the color wheel, then my color is going to be cleaner looking. So try and get away from just mixing and mixing until you think you've matched the photograph. Decide what color that is you're looking at. And I'm thinking this is a reddish orange. So far in the drawing and the painting, I've used a lot of burnt sienna. I don't always. Now I do see some lighter orange to yellow orange in here. So I'm going to add some cad yellow to make it a little lighter in a few places. Now, eventually this will be real dark shadow in here, but I just want to establish it as shadow first before I decide how dark the shadow is going to be. Blue, burnt sienna, a little bit of. And if I paint over these fence posts, not a big deal. I've drawn them in once, I can, draw them in again. So I'm going to make this roof just a little bit bigger. All right, let's get to some different color besides the burnt sienna. And the brushes I'm using are oil bristle brushes. I like to use them for this block-in color stage because the bristle brushes are a little bit stiffer and I can scrub with them a little bit better. And I like them better when they get a little older. They're not as floppy. Then I tend to switch to synthetic brushes when I do the finish stage. So let's go with the blue-green. And I'm going to get blue with a little bit of yellow. And then I'm using white to get it the right value. I didn't need white on the shadow of the barn. I need a little bit of white. So a bluish green. It's not green and it's not yellow green, it's blue green. So make a definite decision. Then if I need to gray that, if it's too intense, I can add a little bit of burnt sienna. And this is somewhat thick, but not real thick. Not when I get to the lights, they're going to be even thicker. And I'm going to try and keep my brush strokes more vertical, mainly just because of the glare. I have a lot of glare in here. I haven't quite figured out how to get rid of it. So I'm going to keep my brush strokes a little more vertical in the darks. Now in the lights, my brush strokes will follow the form. That's real important, to follow the form and not always do the same direction. But in the shadows, I can kind of do the same direction because you don't see form as much in shadows. Yeah, I don't let anything dry. I like to work wet into wet. So that's kind of why, in the drawing stage, real thin. My shadows are a little thicker, but they're still pretty thin. And then when I get to the lights, I'm going to use my palette knife, mix bigger piles of paint, and lay the paint on there pretty thick. So as long as you're going from thin paint to thick paint, you can keep painting. Now, at some point, when I get everything covered, and I'm not quite done yet, sometimes I have to let it dry just because there's so much paint on the canvas or the board. I really can't go any further. So I let it dry. Then I come back when it's dry and add the finishing touches. Or if it's a really big canvas, I will, get the color block in, finished, and then let it dry so I can kind of work kind of wet into dry. But most of the time, especially these smaller paintings, it's wet into wet. And even if I let it dry, I'll work in an area where I can come back and work wet into wet. I'll kind of work into it and get it wet again with paint. Now I'm adding a little bit of white to this blue-green and getting it lighter because the background trees, there's two levels of trees here. These are going to be a little bit lighter to make them recede. Objects get lighter and bluer as they go back. Now I want to get the shadow on the green in front, and this is more of a green. This is kind of a bluish green. This will be a little bit towards yellow green in the shadow. Because it's up front, I'm going to be able to see more color in the green. Now shadows are generally cool. Whatever the sunlight hits is going to be generally warm, and shadows for the most part are cooler looking because there's the lack of the warm sunlight. So shadows will have more blue in it. Light areas will have more yellow orange in it. Now this shadow is still cool, but I'm going to have a bit more yellow in it and a bit of burnt sienna. But it's still going to be cool compared to the sunlit areas. And that's going to be the key contrast between the areas, is that the shadows will be cooler in color to show the lack of sunlight, and then the sunlit areas will be really warm to show the effect of sunlight. And it's that contrast of warm and cool that really suggests the sunlight. So while this is a bit warmer than back there, it's going to be cooler compared to the light area. There's a little tree here that has a shadow. I have to really be concerned about or think about what direction the light's coming. And it's kind of coming a little bit from behind, and it's coming in this way. And that kind of informs the shape of the light areas and the shape of the dark areas. All right, then there's a white building back in here, kind of a grayish building. And it's more neutral. I don't really see a color, although I am going to go violet for that building back in here. So I'm going to make it a violet. So I'll mix violet. I could use this violet, but I like to mix the violet most of the time. This tubed violet I use to just modify warm colors like yellow. Violet is the complement of yellow, so I need that violet to mute or gray down yellow colors. So blue with a little bit of alizarin. So I'm using some alizarin now. And then I'll modify it or mute it with a little burnt sienna. Because it is kind of a neutral color. It's not real strong. So the burnt sienna will gray it. And whether I'm happy with the color or not, the key is what value is that color. And I think the value is correct here. Need to angle it up a bit more. So even if I get a wrong color, as long as the value is right, it's going to work on some level. So don't stress out about the color. If you're having trouble getting the color you want, just make sure it's the right value and the right temperature. This is a cool color and it's a dark. So get the right value and the right temperature. Don't worry as much about what color it is. Now I'm going to go to the light. So I'll start down here. There's some yellow-orange grasses, and there is some yellow-green grasses. So let's go with, I'm going to jump outside the three colors I said I was going to start with. Add a little orange in there as well. But remember, the value, how dark it or light it is more important than the color. So there's kind of a yellow-orange, and I have to add enough white to it to get it light enough. And I'm not adding any paint thinner. Again, if I want that thin, I'll scrub it to thin it a little bit. Now, if I need to mute it, the complement of yellow-orange is a green, blue-green, or blue-violet. So any of those would mute it slightly. Any cool color would mute the warm. I don't need to mute it much. In fact, I don't want to mute it too much because this is sunlit. So I want it to stand out. And I'm going to lay this in before I get to the yellow-green grass. And I might have a little more of this yellow-orange just because I don't want the green to take over. Then next to that, I'm going to go yellow-green because that's the other color I see in there. Then if I need to mute the yellow-green, I can add anything that's warmer. Now the complement of yellow-green is red-violet. I could use the alizarin, or I could use burnt sienna, or even a little bit of orange. It doesn't mute it much, but it does knock it down slightly. And the reason I might want to knock it down is because I don't want all my colors to be screaming at me, just straight from the tube colors. I want some harmony, and you get harmony by controlling how intense the colors are. So if everything is slightly muted, then I can come back and put a few spots of real strong color around the focal point, and that'll really stand out. But if all my colors are just screaming at me, nothing makes a statement. So kind of keep your real strongest colors in reserve. Keep everything maybe just slightly muted. For a while. And I'll go back to the yellow-orange over here. And these are the lights, so I'm getting thicker. I'm not scrubbing on them as much. I'm keeping them a little thicker because the lights need to stand out. I'm also keeping the edge a little softer between the dark and the light. My sharpest edges are going to be in my focal area around the barns. So I'll keep these a little bit softer. And when you hold it like this, it's more wrist movement. But when I hold it back in here, it's more your whole arm. And I'm trying to see big shapes as opposed to small shapes. Now, towards the end of the painting, where I'm wanting to do some detail in here with a smaller brush, then I might hold it, put a little finger there and hold it like this and do that. But for this stage, for blocking in all the big areas of paint, I want to hold it more like this, kind of loosely. I try not to grip it real tight, just using maybe these 3 fingers, or I guess 4. And that way I'm using more of my whole arm instead of just my wrist. Now I want to block in the roof, and I'm going to see the roof as a violet. And this time I will use the tube violet just to show that. Again, I've made the choice of color. Now I could say that's a blue roof, or I could say it's gray. And I would mix gray by using complementary colors. Blue and orange with white will give me gray. Yellow and violet and white will give me gray. But I'm going to see it as a definite color. So I'm going to go with violet. This is kind of the thought process. I pick a color from the color wheel, and I'm going to get it the right value, a little bit darker. You can see how much thicker that is. That's a little better. Now, that's a little too violet, so I want to knock it down either with a little bit of yellow or orange. I'm going to use orange. Yellow is the complement, and that would get it pretty gray. Orange also mutes it, but just not as much. It's a little bit more of a color than just gray. But it's definitely violet. And what I like about oils also is the use of thicker paint. I mean, the color makes a real statement. Better statement when it's thicker in oils. Not so in watercolor, but in oils, it's the thick light areas that really stand out, that really make a statement. You get more texture, you get more of the brush strokes showing. Plus, I don't want this looking like a photograph. I want it to look like paint. So if I keep these lights really thick, I'm going to add more orange because there's some more orange parts to the roof here. I'll go back to the violet a little bit. There's a few darker orange areas in there. Again, don't be overly concerned about color. Think more about the value of the color. Is it dark? Is it light? And not so much about matching the color. Because photographic color is not very good anyway. I mean, it looks good to us when we first see it because we know it's a photograph, that's reality. But if you ever stand and look at a photograph outside compared to the real thing, the photograph is missing so much. So laying in the lights there. Now over here, I have more shadow and light area. So I'm going to do a bit of a shadow here for this roof. And remember, the key is simplifying. Simplify the shape, simplify the values, the darks and the lights. If I have too many little darks and lights everywhere, my painting won't hold together. Then I have the light. This one has a bit more sunlight on it, so it's going to be a little lighter. And I'm going to use white and violet. I'm probably going to add cad yellow this time instead of orange, just to make it warmer. Yellow is warmer than orange, so that's going to stand out a bit more. Now, there's a lot of detail on this roof, but I don't have to paint all of it. I just need to suggest the big shapes of light and dark in there. Now there's a little bit darker here. So I'm looking at the roofs now, the roof of both barns, and getting a little more value change. Now I'm going to jump down to the fence. And the fence is in shadow, and it's kind of a muted gray color. But when I compare it to the roof, I see the fence, the shadow of the fence, not a violet. I'm going to go more blue and orange. Again, it's just kind of a neutral color. So I'm going to think about it being just gray, but maybe a bit on the orange side. So it's kind of like a cool orange. So white and orange and a little bit of blue. And it's going to be lighter. This shadow is going to be lighter than the shadow back behind there. So I'm going to see what. Get it a little lighter. I've made the decision on the color, so I don't need, the color is pretty much just a decision. I could use any color I want on all these big shapes as long as it's a little thick or a little wide. As long as the value is right, the color will always work on some level. So I could have orange trees, yellow trees, purple trees, but if the value is right, they'll work. And that's a good way to learn about color, is to use different color schemes to but going for the right value. I'm going to go back to my light on the trees. I need to get that in there. And this is just the slow process of getting everything filled in, that simple dark and light shape that I started in the thumbnail drawing. Soften edges a little bit there. And before I add more fence, I want to get a darker shadow behind the fence, the blue and the burnt sienna, that kind of reddish orange. It's a bit too dark, so I'll lighten it up a little bit. This will help the fence to stand out more. Because I want that contrast of the dark against the light.
And then after that, Phil, we're gonna take a cliffhanger. We're gonna pause.
Okay.
And then return later on.
That sounds good. Okay.